one more thing. I suggest usually
physical activity interventions and scalability, adaptation, dissemination, and future directions. My name is Joey Leitner. I have the honor of moderating this webinar with 4 great panelists. And so let me, if I can move my screen forward. So today, we're gonna do some welcome and housekeeping stuff. And then this webinar is really split into 2 separate parts. One on terminology and frameworks, and then we're gonna give a couple examples, a Choose to Move program from British Columbia, Canada, and then the Building Healthy Families from Nebraska. After that, we'll do some wrap up and discussion on really next steps, future directions for the field of physical activity science and research. So a couple housekeeping things. First and foremost, happy National Public Health Week. It is Public Health Week in the US. And so to all of our friends and partners, you know, this is the time in which we really try and focus on public health and move this forward. And what a great time to have a scalability or scale up webinar, really thinking about how do we change population physical activity behavior. At any point during the talk today, go ahead and put questions in the chat. We'll be moderating that, but we'll have some time after each presenter to open up the floor for questions, really have some discussion before we move on to the next section. If you'd like to speak, raise your hand if you want to, and I think that we can get you to speak. All of the recordings, this webinar will be recorded, and all of the recordings and material will be available afterwards. So we will send that out to all of the attendees here, as well as post it on the REAIM website and others. So thank you for that. As a quick reminder, APHA abstracts are due April 30th for the physical activity section. We'd love to have any new research coming out, especially if it's on scalability or implementation science, and anything that the folks are doing to really move the field of physical activity research forward. So of course, we could not do this without our partners. Here are some of them listed, as well as all the institutions that the panelists represent. So, this panel takes a lot of time and energy to get up and rolling. These 4 are experts in their field and have really taken, the steps necessary to give us a great talk today. So let's talk about these excellent panelists. First and foremost, we have Lindsay Nettlefold. Lindsay is a senior scientist with the Active Aging Research Team at the University of British Columbia, Canada. She has a background in exercise physiology. Lindsay aims to support individuals of all ages to improve and maintain their physical and social health through physical activity. Specifically, her research focuses on applying and evaluating principles of implementation and scale-up science to health promoting interventions across settings, that is, schools and communities. Lindsay is currently supporting scale-up and evaluation of Choose to Move, a choice-based physical activity program for older adults across British Columbia, Canada, with a particular interest in intervention fidelity, adaptation, and sustainability during scale-up. So we're going to hear about Choose to Move later today. One of Lindsay's colleagues, Dr. Samantha Gray, is also going to be presenting. She's a postdoc researcher with the Active Aging Research Team. Her research is driven by an enduring respect for older adults and a commitment to improve their health. Thus, her recently completed doctoral studies, congratulations, Dr. Gray, focused on how to implement and adapt an older adult physical activity program, again, Choose to Move, for scale up across British Columbia before and during COVID-19. Samantha is currently working on how to adapt Choose to Move to reach a more diverse population of older adults, such as those marginalized by ethnicity, race, and gender, or sex and gender, excuse me. Ms. Caitlin Golden is also going to present. Caitlin's a PhD candidate at the University of Nebraska Medical Center's Health Promotion Program and a member of the Nebraska Childhood Obesity Research Demonstration 3.0 project. Her research focus is dissemination and implementation science and childhood obesity treatment in medically underserved areas, which is, correct me if I'm wrong, I think most of Nebraska. She is interested in improving system support for health promotion in the clinical and community setting. And her work has emphasized physical activity promotion for pediatric obesity. So thank you, Ms. Golden. Our last panelist today is going to be Dr. Paul Estabrooks. Dr. Estabrooks is a community engaged research scientist who has focused on blending of the three missions of higher education, research, teaching, and service, as they relate to health promotion and studying how best to move research into sustained community or clinical practice. This includes the pursuit of a twofold career goal: to advance health promotion science while concurrently having a meaningful impact in the communities that he has partnered with. I think we all share that goal. That's the ultimate goal of science and research. Dr. Estabrooks has applied his training in group dynamics, systems-based approaches, and research practice partnerships to achieve this twofold goal, primarily in the areas of the promotion of physical activity and healthful eating, diabetes prevention, workplace and community weight control, and family-based childhood obesity treatment. Across these areas, Dr. Estabrooks, across these areas, he has had success in scientific advancement of methods to develop scalable and sustainable interventions, has published over 250 articles, and has been consistently funded as a principal or co-principal investigator by the National Institutes of Health since 2000. In addition, within his community partnerships, this work has helped over 300,000 people to be more active, eat better, and lose weight. So thank you all panelists for being here today. I am going to, so we have a few different learning objectives that we want to cover, really defining key terminology related to scalability and scale up, describing how adaptation impacts these interventions, especially for older adults, identifying scale up and scalable strategies, and how to implement a fund to contract strategy through community engaged approaches. And then, of course, describing how to specify scale up outcome strategies and mechanisms, and really how do we move the field forward in this work and get more people active. That's kind of the goals for today. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to invite Dr. Nettlefold to share her screen and get us started today. Dr. Nettlefold, the floor is all yours.
Can I, yeah, okay.
Yeah, your screen looks great.
Yeah, okay, great. So before we jump into the content of today's session, we thought it would be helpful for us to get a better sense of who's with us today. So we've got just a couple of questions, and we're going to try and use the Zoom annotate feature to answer them. So no right or wrong answers here. We're just trying to get some context. So if you haven't used the feature before, there's some instructions in the upper right-hand corner. But quickly, if you navigate to the top of your screen, you should see view options. And if you click in there, there should be an annotate option, and then you can choose a stamp or another tool. And first of all, we just love to know where folks are joining from today. Okay, not seeing too much come up on here, but a little bit of distribution. Okay, give a few more seconds. All right, so the next question that we had is on this spectrum that's sort of anchored on the left by being 100% of your time, if your current role is research and 100% of your current role is practice, we're just curious about where folks identify on this spectrum. Okay, mostly research. Okay, that's great. And our next question then is, what is your experience with implementation science, ranging from like no experience to you've done a lot of work in implementation science? All right. So pretty on the experienced end here. That's great. And finally, what's your experience with Scale Up, which is sort of the focus of what we're talking about today? All right. So we're in the middle of Scale Up here. Okay, so thanks for sharing. That's helpful. That's helpful for us. So now that we know a bit about who is here with us today, it brings us to the question of why we're here. And so I'm going to go ahead and assume that what brings us all together today is this desire or motivation to enhance physical activity in the people that we serve. And there's a really lovely quote that we refer to a lot in our work that says, developing effective interventions is just a first step towards improving the health and well-being of a population. And that's from a 2008 paper by Durlak and Dupre. And the way that this quote has really impacted the work of our team is in understanding that, there's many effective physical activity interventions that are available. That's not where we see the problem, but what's missing is that if we want to improve health at the population level, so reaching lots of people across lots of different settings, we first need to implement programs well so they remain effective. And then second, we need to go beyond implementation in one place and scale up those effective interventions. So I have been tasked with starting us off today, and my name is Lindsay. I'm from the Active Aging Research Team, which is led by Dr. Heather McKay and Dr. Joni Sims-Gould, and we're at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. And to set the stage for our discussion today, the panelists, we identified a few sort of key terms that we wanted to highlight and review. Before we really dive in, I just want to acknowledge that both Samantha and I, and so Samantha will be speaking next, are grateful to be joining from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations. And our work spans the province of British Columbia on the west coast of Canada, and we are really grateful for the opportunity to work across our beautiful province. So there's a large gap between what's known from research and what actually gets used in practice. And the World Health Organization has called this the no-do gap. There is an accompanying statistic that is often thrown around that on average it takes about 17 years for research to make it into day-to-day practice. And really what this comes down to is that there are substantially more resources invested in discovering new interventions, treatments, and approaches than in figuring out how to take what we already know works and deliver it effectively in practice. But this isn't the only gap when it comes to these evidence-based interventions. So on the left side of this slide, you can see the research to practice gap that we just talked about illustrated. And on the right side is another gap. So how do we take what may already be being used in practice and deliver it broadly enough to elicit outcomes at a population level? And we call this the implementation to scale up gap. Now, the common thread between these two important gaps is that we can use implementation science to understand and improve what we're doing with the downstream hope of improving health outcomes in populations. So we're going to unpack some of these terms over the next couple of slides. So the first, what is implementation science? So it seems like we have a pretty knowledgeable crowd here today, but just so that everyone's on the same page, the field of implementation science is really trying to address the no-do gap in health promotion. So the formal definition that we use in our team is shown on the slide, but briefly, implementation science is the scientific study of methods that support the movement of research into practice. So it's not really the movement itself, but it's studying the methods of how do we best do this. In contrast, implementation, the process of putting to use, is the process of doing it. So the implementation is the doing part. And finally, scale up is the process of expanding effective interventions into policy or practice to positively impact more people. So just as a quick summary, we have implementation and scale up, which we see as both our processes, and then implementation science is the scientific study of the methods that support both of those processes. So digging further into the difference between the processes of implementation and scale up, in our work, we view these as overlapping concepts that are conceptually distinct, but not mutually exclusive. So the way that we describe it is that you can implement without scaling up, but you can't scale up without implementing. Now, implementation and scale up coexist on a continuum or within a program lifecycle that spans development, implementation, maintenance or sustainability, and scale up. So on this slide, we've illustrated the scale-up continuum, and we're using data from a paper by Andrew Malat and colleagues, where they summarized and classified the physical activity literature into these categories. And the main takeaway is that across this continuum of physical activity research, from descriptive studies to efficacy, effectiveness, and onto dissemination and scale-up, the vast majority of physical activity research lies in the descriptive and efficacy studies. Only 3% of the studies were classified as dissemination or scale-up. And we acknowledge that these data are a little dated now, so this is from 2011 paper, but we recently published a systematic review that explored implementation of physical activity interventions for older adults. And very similar to this, only about 4% of the studies we included were classified as scaled up. The one important note about the scale-up continuum is that in an ideal world, only interventions that demonstrated efficacy in a well-designed trial would move forward and be scaled up. But in reality and in practice, process is not necessarily linear, and the boundary between implementation and scale-up can be a little bit fuzzy. So this raises a question: why do so few interventions get scaled up? And I think the short answer is that it's pretty hard to do. When you think about all of the factors that could contribute to whether an intervention is scaled up, there's a lot of things to consider. So the figure on this slide is from a scale-up framework that we use extensively in our work, and it's from Yemi and was published in 2011. And essentially, this framework proposes 6 categories of factors that influence scale-up, and these are shown in the different colors in the figure. So for example, starting in the middle in that light blue or green color, depending on what your screen's showing, are characteristics of the intervention itself. So how simple and easy is the intervention to deliver? Moving one step out, what are the characteristics of the individuals who are implementing? Are they involved in the process? And next, is the approach selected? For example, using a phased approach to scale up can help facilitate the process. So what approach is being taken? There are also characteristics of the community or the organization that's adopting. Are they engaged and motivated? There are political and cultural contexts to consider. For example, political will has a huge impact on whether things are supported for scale up. And finally, it's important to consider the research and incorporating it into this ongoing process of scale up. So we've got a few things that are process oriented, a few things that are contextual, and some aspects of the innovation itself. So if our goal is to scale up, then we need to better understand what do we need to get there? And that's where the frameworks can help guide us. It can help us determine whether our intervention is scalable given all of those factors. So scalability is the ability of an intervention that was proven effective in controlled conditions to be expanded under real world conditions to reach more people and stay effective. Tuning into that last piece on effectiveness, it really speaks to the need for ongoing evaluation as a critical part of the scale-up process. So although evaluation should be incorporated at all stages of the program lifecycle, the focus of the evaluation is going to change as you move along in the program lifecycle. So on this slide, we've got the scale-up continuum that we saw previously at the top in the purple bubbles. And at the bottom, we've got some stacked wedges that are illustrating, the goal is to illustrate the proportion of the evaluation that's going to be focused on effectiveness versus the proportion of the evaluation that's focused on implementation. So as you can see on the left side of the screen, the interventions that are in the development or the efficacy testing stages are typically evaluated based on the impact or efficacy of the intervention on participant level outcomes. There may be some limited data collected on how well the intervention was delivered, but really the main focus is on effectiveness. Now, as interventions proceed to effectiveness or the real world trials and scale-up trials, the focus on participant level health impact decreases, and there's a shift towards evaluating implementation, how much and how well it was delivered, as well as facilitators and barriers to implementation, and then also related to this, evaluating the implementation strategies that are used to deliver the intervention. So to help researchers with the implementation evaluation portion of studies, we recently published this paper where Heather McKay is the lead author, and as it's published as a bit of a roadmap to support researchers. The piece that I want to pull out of this paper is the expert-generated recommendations for a minimum data set of implementation indicators. So this really is just, at a minimum, what should we be measuring with respect to implementation during our studies? So we call these implementation indicators as a broad umbrella term, and they fall into two major groups. There's implementation determinants, which are the factors that influence implementation and scale up. And then there's implementation outcomes, which is the result of the strategies used to implement and scale up. Now, I've included the full list of the minimum data set here, but just to help clarify the determinants and outcomes piece, we'll just talk about a couple of examples. So an example of an implementation determinant would be how acceptable is your intervention to the delivery team, or how compatible is your intervention with the organization's mission. Those are determinants at the intervention level, but you can also ask those questions one step further and ask, how acceptable are your implementation strategies, and how compatible are the implementation strategies with the organization? As an example of outcomes could be, what was the dose of the intervention that was delivered, or what is the adoption of the intervention like? And you can also, those are at the level of the intervention, but you can also ask those at the level of the implementation strategy. So what is the dose of implementation strategies delivered, or what is the adoption of particular implementation strategies? So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to hand it over to Samantha now, who's going to build on this and share some of the work that our team's been doing over the past 7 years.
Can I get a thumbs up that my slides are sharing? All right, thanks so much, Lindsay. So I'm Samantha Gray, and I work with Lindsay on the Active Aging Research team. And I'm delighted to be here today to talk to you a little bit about Choose to Move, which is a health promotion intervention for older adults. Specifically, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how we used strategic adaptation approaches to support broad scale up of this community-based physical activity and social support intervention for older adults. So to start, Choose to Move is a 6-month choice-based health promotion intervention for older adults that increases physical activity and mobility while decreasing loneliness. And within Choose to Move, participants are supported by an activity coach through 3 main intervention activities. The first is a one-on-one consult where activity coaches guide participants to set goals and create an action plan. The second are group meetings where groups of 12 to 15 participants gather to learn about health topics and share what is helping or preventing them from being physically active. And third, activity coaches call our participants regularly to check in and provide support. Finally, I would like to highlight that Choose to Move is implemented in collaboration with delivery partners. So by delivery partners, I mean individuals across levels of our partnered organizations. So this includes organization leads, provincial coordinators, recreation coordinators, and our activity coaches. And our 2 main delivery partners are the British Columbia Recreation and Parks Association and the YMCA. So Choose to Move has followed a phased scale-up approach, which Lindsay mentioned earlier in the YAMI framework, and it has increased in its reach since 2015. And so at every phase of Choose to Move's program lifecycle, it has been evaluated across levels of the socio-ecological continuum. That is delivery partner leads, provincial coordinators, recreation coordinators, activity coaches, and our older adult participants. And we gathered all of this data to develop, adapt, and improve the fit of Choose to Move for different contexts. And our phased scale up includes 5 instances of adaptation, which I introduce briefly now, and then we'll provide additional details on subsequent slides. So the first instance of adaptation was to the British Columbia context. Second was adapting to improve the fit with our delivery partners. Third, to reduce costs to support continued scale up of Choose to Move. Fourth, a bit unexpectedly, in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And fifth, we adapted to new delivery systems to try to increase the reach of Choose to Move. So as a high-level snapshot, I wanted to provide this slide that shows Choose to Move's delivery to date. So we have delivered in more than 90 sites across 60 communities in British Columbia, including more than 700 programs reaching nearly 7,000 older adult participants in our province. So now I'm going to dive in a little bit further and describe the role of adaptation in supporting the scaled up delivery of Choose to Move. So for those who usually conduct randomized control trials, adaptation might sound a bit counterintuitive. Why would we move away from the evidence-based interventions that we know work? And I hope to shed a little bit of light on that. So adaptation is a critical part of delivering interventions at larger and larger scale. And it can be defined as a process of thoughtful and deliberate alteration to either the design or the delivery of an intervention, with the ultimate goal of improving its fit or its effectiveness in a given context. And so when I say fit, I mean to make your intervention fit as for a specific or a new use or a new situation. And this is often done by making a modification. I also note that adaptation, as defined here, is quite purposeful. However, adaptation can also happen in an unplanned or reactive way, and this is often during intervention delivery. And so adaptation lives alongside of fidelity, which is the extent to which the intervention corresponds to the originally intended program. And while it's not always clearly articulated, fidelity, just like adaptation, may apply to the intervention itself or to its delivery. And so efforts to maximize the internal validity of an intervention, that is, delivering it with really high fidelity, can come at the cost of external validity, that is, an intervention's generalizability to diverse settings and diverse populations. Which brings me to a key tension within implementation science, which is the adaptation fidelity dilemma. So though adaptation is deemed necessary by many scholars, it generates a potential clash or tension between researchers' aim to retain fidelity to the evidence-based interventions they know work, and at the same time responding to the needs and desires of intervention delivery partners and intervention participants. So to try to strike a balance requires that researchers engage local stakeholders from across different levels. For instance, participants, practitioners, decision makers, and to seek their input to guide the adaptation process. So this is sometimes called co-creation, which integrates practice-based evidence from our practitioners, experience from our participants, with evidence-based practice from researchers. And so adapting an intervention and its implementation to context to improve fit at scale up is critical for success. And for Choose to Move, all of our adaptations were made in consultation with stakeholders across levels, and we aimed to be fidelity consistent. That is, to retain fidelity to the core functions of the intervention. And so we consider core functions to really be those active ingredients of the intervention. And for us, those are specific behavior change techniques that we applied throughout the intervention, such as goal setting and action planning. So as I noted earlier, I'm now going to provide a little bit more detail on each of those 5 instances of adaptation. So in 2015, the British Columbia Ministry of Health released a physical activity strategy where older adults were identified as a priority group. And in partnership with the ministry, our team co-created the health promotion intervention we now call Choose to Move. So in the first place, during those planning and development stages, to inform the design of Choose to Move, we looked to CHAMPS, which is the Community Healthy Activities Model Program for Seniors. And CHAMPS had been successfully implemented at scale across diverse communities in California. And so we adapted CHAMPS in consultation with stakeholders, including delivery partner organizations and older adults living in British Columbia, to ensure its fit for the British Columbia context. The elements we adopted from CHAMPS include a choice-based telephone-assisted approach where participants choose activities based on their personal preferences, their health status, their resources, and their readiness to change. And we also incorporated elements of CHAMPS that were common to other successful physical activity interventions. For example, theory-based motivational techniques and one-to-one support. So the second adaptation took place in 2017 and was conducted to enhance fit with our two main delivery partners, the British Columbia Recreation and Parks Association and the YMCA. So this planned systematic adaptation process took place while we were already implementing Choose to Move, and we were keen to support its continued scale up. So we engaged our delivery partners to understand how to better fit Choose to Move in their organizations and what was needed in order to proceed to broad scale delivery. We heard from delivery partners that increased opportunities to socially connect within the intervention was important. And thus we added a group meeting and we modified the activity coach training to help promote that social cohesion. And for reference, at small scale, prior to this adaptation, we had delivered 56 programs. And then following this adaptation, we delivered 164 programs. So our third adaptation process began in 2019 and was conducted to reduce delivery costs of Choose to Move in order to enhance its potential for sustainability. This was again a planned systematic adaptation process, and it also took place while we were already implementing Choose to Move. So we engaged our delivery partners to inform options for cost reduction. And the adapted model resulted in a 50% decrease in delivery hours and included the removal of the telephone check-ins from activity coaches. However, before we could roll out this reduced cost model of Choose to Move, we were interrupted by the COVID-19 pandemic. And therefore, our fourth adaptation process was unexpected and occurred in rapid response to the pandemic. So briefly, in facing those lockdown measures here in British Columbia in March 2020, our team rapidly changed course to offer Choose to Move in the home through virtual delivery. And our delivery partners were keen to collaborate on this effort to continue supporting older adults who were isolating at home. So we offered Choose to Move in this modified format through 6 virtual group meetings over the course of 3 months. And with this shift, we did our best to maintain all the core functions of the in-person model of Choose to Move. For instance, goal setting and action planning. And then finally, our fifth adaptation was for delivery of Choose to Move through new delivery systems. That is, new and smaller delivery partner organizations. So in earlier phases of Choose to Move's delivery, we reached mostly older women who were white. And thus we aim to increase our reach to more diverse populations of older adults by engaging with new delivery partner organizations. So this work with new delivery partners began in 2018 and is ongoing. So these planned adaptations take place in collaboration with each new delivery partner organization that we onboard. And for each organization, we work together to adapt Choose to Move to fit their needs, considering factors such as staffing, infrastructure, the specific populations they serve, and their general capacity. And so the adapted model for each small organization looks a little bit different, and the evaluation of these adapted models is ongoing. So just to wrap up, on behalf of Lindsay and I would like to take a moment to acknowledge and thank all of the folks who make our research possible, and to thank you, our audience, for your time and attention today.
Well, thank you, Samantha, and thank you, Lindsay. We do have a few minutes for questions, so while you guys are putting those questions in the question box that we're monitoring, I have a couple already. So, Lindsay, you know, when we're talking about scale up and scalable interventions, how do we also talk about sustainability within that? What is the role of sustainability in scale up, and what does that look like for you guys and then for the rest of us?
That's a really great question. I think sustainability has something that it's like emerging as a big focus, I think, in the literature right now, and it's something that has been identified as a huge gap in terms of what's been done, right? And if programs aren't sustained, you know, the risk is that it's a huge waste of time and energy and resources that have gone into developing a program that's then not sustained. There's obviously a lot of challenges to sustainability, and I think, you know, in our experience physical activity and preventive health, like part of the challenge is that governments don't often allocate specific line items for a specific program. And so then when governments are changing and priorities are changing, it can be challenging, from a funding perspective, for example, to maintain that. But I think, the part of the, so scaling and sustaining are both kind of these processes, right? They're both things that are happening kind of on an ongoing basis. So there's similarities in that. And there is the ISAT, the Intervention Scalability Assessment Tool, which was published by Andrew Millat and his group a couple of years ago, really talks about, in order to be scalable, an intervention also has to be sustainable. They're kind of there's a lot of relationships in there. So I think that, they're very closely linked to those two concepts.
That is great. So I don't know if Samantha or Paul, Caitlin have anything to add on that question.
Just that it was a great response by Lindsay.
Samantha, you talk about COVID and kind of the stuff that happened with COVID, and I think all of us who deliver physical activity interventions had to deal with that. Do you want to elaborate a little bit more on that, and what does an adaptation on 156, is that right, sites look like during COVID?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'll do my best to approach it adequately. So just to backtrack a little bit. So where we were in terms of Choose to Move's delivery was we were at what we call phase 3. So that means we had participants who were starting programs in sort of the winter of 2020 or January, February 2020. So we had folks who were actually right in the middle of programs when COVID landed. And we're in this sort of bind of what do we do? No one can meet in person anymore. And we're very fortunate to have these strong partnerships with our partners. And they wanted to continue supporting these older adults. And we as researchers didn't want them left behind. So we quickly switched to online, to Zoom, to finish up the programs that were already running. And while we did that, we used it as a bit of a feasibility trial in a way to understand, okay, can we deliver the group meetings over Zoom? Can we have a telephone option for folks who don't have internet access? Because we are talking about older adult populations who have often different technology use patterns. So that was very quick. And then we rolled out what we called Choose to Move at Home after we had sort of done that quick adaptation. And what ended up happening is, because Choose to Move was usually an in-person program where people, say in the city of Vancouver or any of the other communities would meet and gather in person, we were actually able to have, a coach who was maybe in the south of British Columbia deliver a program for folks living all across the province and bring them together virtually. So in terms of accessibility, we actually found some new ways to engage folks who might not have had an in-person program delivered in their part of the province if it was more remote or rural. So a lot happened and it was very quick, but we found our way and bumbled through Zoom and phone-in approaches.
Well, I definitely congratulate you on being able to figure that out, because I know from our work it's tough, and you guys obviously did a great job. James Scarborough has a question. What were some of the advantages or supports that you had in implementing Choose to Move in British Columbia versus other communities in Canada or the US? And then the second part of that is, did it rank pretty highly in fitness culture to start with? It's a lot in a question. Great question, James. Oh, Dr. Estabrooks, would you like to take a stab at this?
I didn't have anything to do with that one, and I think I just accidentally clicked a button technology-wise that I was waiting excitedly for Samantha's response.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, I saw that. I was like, okay, well, Samantha.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think about the most succinct way to respond. Interesting in terms of fitness culture. So I know that, so one of our main partners was, or sorry, our two main delivery partners, the British Columbia Recreation and Parks Association and the YMCA, are both organizations that offer a number of physical activity program options. And so when our participants come into, Choose to Move group meetings, their activity coaches, a number of them actually teach fitness classes or other rec programs within those facilities, and they can sort of draw participants in to those programs right there as an option to become more physically active. So I think there was a nice sort of synergy. But I know that our coaches, every participant has different sort of interests and values. So some of them are directed more to, going for walks on their own or going for bike rides or whatever it might be. So in terms of ranking it in fitness culture, I think because Choose to Move is choice-based, the choices are limitless in some ways. So I'm not sure that I know how to answer that really directly in terms of fitness culture, but I think some of the first part of the question, the advantages or support, I think the main piece that we always go back to is that we have these really strong partnerships in place to allow us to deliver Choose to Move, and it's building that trust and rapport with partners that has allowed us to start in 2015 and still be delivering in 2022.
You talk a lot about partnerships, and public health is all about partnerships. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Like, have you worked with those partners in the past? What are some aspects of that relationship? How did that really great partnership come about?
Right. So Lindsay can feel free to jump in here too, if you'd like. So many of these partnerships began before I was with the team, and I think even maybe some years before that. So the leads of our team, Dr. Heather McKay and Dr. Joni Simsgold, have longstanding relationships with folks within the Ministry of Health. And they were there sort of at the outset with the that 2015 physical activity strategy that the province of British Columbia released. And so I think that being at the table right from there, older adults were identified as a priority group. And from that, there was sort of this cascade of interactions with what community organizations are serving older adults and have the same sort of mission and values as our research team. Can we connect with them and build from there? But I don't know if I'm doing that enough justice. Lindsay, happy for you to dive in.
I think you've done a great job. I think the only other piece I would highlight is really the longstanding relationships with government, and sort of, Heather has been working with to deliver and scale up Action Schools BC, which was a school-based intervention. And so it's been this kind of decades-long investment in that partnership and experience in scaling up province-wide, I think, really was really helpful to us.
Sounds like there's champions in there and a whole bunch of other things that just seem to work really well together. So thank you both so much for your great talks and answering these great questions. I want to invite Caitlin to share her screen. Yeah, do you want to flip it? Because I think it's on it's on presenter screen, but I think it's the opposite one.
Okay, 1 second.
Sorry about
I knew
that.
I would be the one to do this to everybody. Not even that old. Just kidding. Okay, sorry, 1 second. Apologize. All right.
That looks great. Thank you, Caitlin.
Is this okay, or should I do it again?
Oh, it did it. It flipped it back to the other way. You should just be able to, yeah, however you would like.
Okay, I'll just do it that way. So for my notes here, apologies again.
No, you're
Thought I
great.
had it ready.
No.
Okay. So I am going to talk a little bit today about dissemination and kind of follow up a little bit on what Lindsay and Samantha talked about here. And so Lindsay had talked about kind of that translation gap. And this is mostly likely due to ineffective dissemination of your evidence-based interventions, programs, and practices. So dissemination science is the study of targeted distribution of information and intervention materials to specific public health or clinical practice audiences. And so dissemination is an active approach of spreading evidence-based interventions to target audience via determined channels using planned strategies. And so one goal of implementation science is to expand the use of evidence-based practice programs and policies to create the biggest public health impact. So I think when most people think about dissemination, they think of posters, presentations, and papers, but you really want to try to make this more of a planned approach and an active approach to disseminating your research. And it should include system-based approaches with network weaving that can increase the likelihood of your intervention being adopted. And so the
Hey,
intent—
Caitlin, I'm so sorry. I don't know if you wanted to switch your screens again, because we see, yeah, we see all your notes and stuff. Not that, I mean, I would love to see your notes. I think it's very valuable, but I don't know if you.
One second. I apologize. It
You're
might
great.
just be what it is.
Okay, we have time built in if that's what it takes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what do we know about?
And I don't think we can see your screen now. Sorry.
I am struggle busing. I'm just making it so that it's good for Dr. Esterberg. I will be the one to do this. Okay. So what do we know about disseminating evidence-based practices and programs? So essentially, it does not occur spontaneously or naturally. So this is what we're talking about. You want to kind of have a planned approach to this. Passive approaches to dissemination are largely ineffective. Also, single source prevention messages are generally less effective than comprehensive multi-level approaches. Want to make sure that you have stakeholder involvement in the research or evaluation process to enhance dissemination. So really looking to take your research to the users here. Theories and frameworks for dissemination are beneficial. And then the process of dissemination should be tailored to a specific audience. So you really want to consider the context of where you're trying to scale up your intervention. And so we need effective dissemination and implementation strategies in order for this to happen. So what are those? They're methods or techniques used to enhance the adoption, implementation, and sustainability of evidence-based programs or practices. And they focus on increasing our implementation outcomes. And then dissemination strategies specifically focus on communicating the key information about your intervention to increase the likelihood of adoption of your intervention. And so wanted to provide some resources here for anyone who is newer to implementation science for how do I find these strategies. And so there's been a lot of compilations of implementation strategies over the year, and a refinement of them has generated a list of about 73 strategies here. And also you can use concept mapping. They created 9 kind of categories to help you kind of figure out the context and where your barriers or facilitators are within that context to better fit your strategies into your intervention. So what I want to talk about today is our project. It's the CDC's Childhood Obesity Research Demonstration Project. It focuses on adapting and testing evidence-based childhood obesity interventions for children in lower income families. So our team is the University of Nebraska at Kearney and the University of Nebraska Medical Center. received funding to adapt an evidence and family-based pediatric weight management intervention into a user-friendly program and training with program materials for micropolitan and rural communities in Nebraska. So our larger trial is a hybrid type 3 effectiveness implementation pilot study. We're looking at the adoption, implementation, and sustainability of building healthy families. And so specifically today, I was going to talk about our aim 1, which is to determine if the dissemination strategy that includes a fund and contracting for pediatric weight management delivery, using formal commitments from community organizations to promote network weaving, and provide us information on kind of local demand for our intervention, and then hopefully lead to the adoption of the program. And so a little bit about building healthy families. It's an adaptation of Epstein's traffic light eating plan, which is one of kind of the most widely researched intervention for children here. Carney has implemented it for over 10 years, and it's demonstrated success for both children and adults. They do yearly cohorts. They have 10 of them going before we started this trial. It's a family-based program, focuses on behavior change strategies, improved dietary intake, and increased physical activity. And so part of this was kind of considering what our core components of our program is as well. So uses simple nutrition education, the traffic light eating plan that includes lifestyle modification, self-regulation and goal setting, fun family physical activity that's non-sport specific, social support from both families and coordinators to reinforce their goal setting, and the curriculum from the education, and then family engagement, which is an important component as well. So session structure for our program, it's 12 weeks and sessions are offered weekly. It's a 2-hour time commitment. And then we also have 6 refresher sessions that focus on relapse prevention. And then it also kind of introduces the participants to community activity resources so that they get more confident in using the resources available to them in their community to be physically active. And then it is family-based. So we encourage everyone that can in the family to participate. So the funding contract dissemination strategy focuses on organizational and community adoption. And so organizational incentives have been used to increase the likelihood of adoption, but not many of them have been used outside of a clinical setting or a metropolitan community. And so we are using the funding contract, which included a moderate budget and formal commitments from communities to adopt building healthy families. And so this really is looking to identify delivery systems that prioritize a given issue and are motivated and ready to implement a program. And so really just looking for those communities who have demonstrated some initial capacity and readiness for implementing, instead of kind of pushing your program on them when they might not necessarily be ready for the intervention. And so this dissemination strategy is practical and under-resourced areas because it allows us to focus limited resources to communities who have established readiness and initial capacity to do so. So this is our study that we looked at for this, and we wanted to test the feasibility of a funding contract dissemination strategy to identify and engage communities that would adopt building healthy families in rural and micropolitan areas of Nebraska. And so, as mentioned, we were looking at organizational readiness to change assessment scores, and then we also had them do community narratives to respond to our request for applications to get a more qualitative look into what's going on in their communities and how ready they were to implement building healthy families. But this also gave our Learning Collaborative an opportunity to rank communities based on their applications. And so anyone was eligible to participate in our study if they were located out of our 2 largest metropolitan areas in Nebraska. So I think Dr. Leitner had mentioned earlier, that's pretty much the whole state. Outside of the eastern part of our state is the most heavily populated. So we used a 3-phased approach to determine the local demand, motivation, and commitment to adopt, implement, and sustain building healthy families. So in our first phase, we used a systems-based approach to collaborate with our partners, our existing partners across Nebraska. They were past implementers of the program and participants, but as well as public health officials and practitioners. And so we worked with our advisory board to create our request for funding application. And then they also helped us in the selection process. So phase 2, we were looking to assess the local demand for the package, pediatric weight management intervention, and potential determinants of adoption. So in this phase, we asked the communities would send in their letter of intent, and then they also completed the organizational readiness to change assessment. Here, we asked that they had someone from a decision-making position, and then someone also who would be responsible for implementing the program. Phase 3, we identified communities that were ready to pilot test building healthy families. And again, that was through our community narratives and the community advisory board ranking applications. And so our results here, this map kind of gives you an idea of our distribution of the RFA. And so we were able to identify, we're able to reach all 93 counties in Nebraska with the RFA, and then identified communities that were interested through our letter of intent, which narrowed down the number of communities that we were able to get to send in our LOI and organizational readiness for change assessment. So that is the darker grays here. White is not eligible. And essentially what we were left with is the pink, which is the 7 communities that signed a formal commitment to adopt and pilot building healthy families. So the information that we're gathering from this is going to help us to provide information on translating evidence-based pediatric weight management programs to medically underserved areas by looking for those organizations that were ready and had the initial capacity to adopt through this dissemination strategy. And so then just like to acknowledge our team for the work that they've done on this project and allowing me to mess up our presentation here by share screening. But anyone have any questions about our dissemination strategy?
Well, Caitlin, I think that was a great presentation. Thank you so much. And I think this idea of using an RFA as a dissemination tool is brilliant. So I think that's really great. I will actually turn to Dr. McKay's question. Did you offer support to enhance readiness? So training or information to those community organizations that were not quite ready, but showed interest?
And so this was a question that we had actually received when we were going through the publication process of this study. It's not something we did now, but it is something we're looking for using the community narrative process for a way when we look to scale this out further of how do we help establish readiness in communities instead of just helping ones that already have the capacity for it. So then we're not missing out on maybe communities that need it the most just because they're not necessarily ready, but kind of developing that capacity for readiness.
Caitlin, did you find that you had that there was something that maybe you couldn't measure that was a key indicator of readiness, like that community had a grant writer or that they were already engaged in other projects? Was there a key factor that go ahead.
I think the capacity piece is one that we are constantly getting hit with here, especially during COVID, because readiness was pretty high in our assessments pre-COVID, and then COVID hit, and so they still want to do the program, but it's not quite the same. And so yeah, there's definitely pieces that go in there that we weren't anticipating for barriers kind of to readiness. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Yeah, I think it totally does. And I do want to offer, I don't know, Paul, I saw that you unmuted. Did you have a follow-up to that?
I did. And, just from the standpoint that the way that the RFA process engaged communities was to try and identify partnerships and have explicit roles for those focused on reach and explicit roles for those focused on implementation. And then within each one of those organizations, we needed both decision maker and doer commitment to engage. So it really was built in a way that we should have pulled together communities that at least had done some partnership before and understood that there's more than just saying we're going to do it and we'll do it through our single organization. And for most of these communities, to do an interdisciplinary approach to childhood obesity treatment, you needed to go to different institutions. All of the people that would be involved in that recruitment and implementation process aren't housed under the same roof. And so it really did move it towards, do we get ready communities? And the second thing I'd say, and this is more, I think, in reference to Heather's first question, was Caitlin presented on the initial aim. The second aim is to see the degree to which these communities can implement the intervention with and without learning collaborative engagement. And so we have some that will get just an online training module with all the resources necessary that a community needs to implement the program, and then half the communities engage in a learning collaborative that focuses on re-aim outcomes, reach, effectiveness, adoption, implementation, and long-term maintenance.
Well, I think this is brilliant, and I will mimic Heather's last comment that we're excited to hear about next steps, because I think that this really does have a large-scale impacts that people go where the money is, and if we can push certain programs through this process, it's a great thing. Dr. Esterberg, I want to invite you. You're already sharing your screen. Do you want to try and hit the presenter button? See if it'll beautiful. All right. The floor is yours.
Just let it be noted that the young doctoral student didn't quite get this, but the old dinosaur professor.
I have a concussion, so just want to throw it out there.
All right, I'm starting my timer here. Well, this has been really fun for me because I've got to interact with these exceptional early career scholars that are focused on scale up and scalability. And so my job was to kind of come up with some ideas about where we might go next with this type of work. And so one of the beautiful things about being able to do these webinars via Zoom is that I'm able to adapt and update slides as we go through. So I've kind of changed around my my approach here. And some of it is based on the audience that we have, that we do have a good proportion of folks that have some good background in dissemination and implementation science. But, one of the things that strikes me, and it struck me, for a number of years, and it kind of hit home as Lindsay was talking through the idea of how are we even defining scale up and scalability. And when I think about it, I think about it from two levels. One, are we trying to scale up participants, which would be enhancing the reach of an intervention, or are we trying to scale up organizationally, which would enhance the adoption of an intervention, and of course, by function, also increase reach. And so when I look through the definitions that and these are definitions that we're using as well, I feel like they're a little bit, I think they're a little bit too focused on evidence-based approaches and on a pipeline development of interventions that starts with, going through the efficacy, effectiveness to dissemination, in particular when we're talking about physical activity promotion now, where there is a huge body of literature that can identify evidence-based principles. And so, I started thinking a little bit about those things. And of course, folks that know me know that I use the REAIM framework. And so I really do think about scale up and scalability from the idea of reach and adoption and long-term maintenance, so sustainability of the intervention at an organizational level. And from here, I kind of came up with some key research questions. And I'm not going to talk through each one of these right now. I'm going to kind of go through some other slides, but I just wanted to give you a little bit of a moment to, these are the places that I was thinking of, both as we were hearing the earlier presentations, as well as things I've thought about just through my own work life. So when I'm talking about those definitions, one of the things I thought about was, could we simplify things? And I think that Lindsay did a really nice job when she was talking about distinctions between processes and outcomes. And, and when I think about scalability, I think of it from the standpoint of it really is about the evidence-based intervention. I also agree with Lindsay that we can think about scalability of implementation strategies, but I'm going to leave that for maybe another webinar that we could do some other time. And so when I think about it, it's really scalability is about the characteristics of the intervention that make it amenable to increasing reach, adoption, or both, right? So it really is about what is it about the intervention. And so, and again, Lindsay gave some nice examples of characteristics of innovations. I still am a bit of a traditionalist, like to start with the Rogerian characteristics of an innovation. And so, things like relative advantage, compatibility, I won't read through the whole list, but these are all things that are characteristics of a given physical activity intervention that can either increase its likelihood of being scaled or decrease it. And so it's the scalability of the intervention itself. And when we think about these characteristics, it's also important. And I think that, Lindsay did the setup for this and did a really great job, because we really need to be thinking about these characteristics of an intervention from both the population that we intend to benefit from it. Obviously, if we intend to enhance reach, we have to have an intervention that people are going to want to join and want to participate in. And so we need to engage the target audience, and we need to understand their perceptions of these characteristics. But we also need to understand the perceptions of these characteristics from the implementation setting. So that's kind of the under what conditions piece here. One of the things that I truly believe, and I think that it's an area for us to continue to consider, is that I think focusing on scalability, even in efficacy trials, is critically important, right? And so it's not just a thing about implementation science. It's not just a thing about where we are once we've got our effectiveness studies. We can be thinking about the attributes of an intervention that make it more or less scalable right from the get-go when we design it. And then, one of the things that I think is really key and I don't know that we've talked about that yet in the webinar, is that when we talk about scale up and in this case in scalability, it's really important that we make sure that we have perspectives related to the characteristics of the innovation that come from a broad representation of the audience, right? And in particular, we want to make sure that we focus on people that may be experiencing physical activity related health disparities, right? So if we already know that groups aren't getting physical activity, and we design scalable interventions that do not engage those folks, but do engage the majority population, we run the risk of enhancing disparities and moving away from health equity. And so representativeness, I think, is critical when we think about both reach and adoption. So then, okay, so that's my scalability little soapbox. So the next soapbox is about scale up. And again, I think that the earlier presenters all talked about this: strategies and processes intended to increase reach, adoption, or both. Okay, and as you can think about this type of thing, we have a lot of different dissemination and implementation strategies, and they fall into a lot of, and what I think we have like 5 or maybe 6 buckets. So, you know, some of the approaches or the processes can be planning based, and those can be in partnership with the intended audience and delivery systems. So when we heard a little bit earlier about co-production of evidence, this is the type of thing that we would do, right? We would partner with those who are most likely to benefit and those who would provide services to those folks to really try and advance physical activity interventions that focus on closing the health disparities and the equity gap, as well as closing that gap between evidence and practice. We have education-based approaches for dissemination that can be things like marketing to the stakeholders. Like, you know, I was talking in one of my earlier meetings today that it's really, you know, kind of the low bar for when you talk about trying to enhance reach or adoption of evidence-based interventions is, you know, people need to know about them. If they don't know about them, they're definitely not going to engage in them. And so, you know, this idea of having, you know, kind of marketing and education-based approaches, finance-based. So I think Caitlin gave a really good example of using a fund and contract approach that was, there was incentives with it, but not incentives to such a degree that that would be the only reason a community would engage. And, you know, we've done a lot of work with REACH where we've demonstrated that very modest financial incentives that focus on weight loss can greatly increase the participation in evidence-based interventions. And so, you know, these are things that, you know, I think a lot of times, or at least when I talk about incentives related to physical activity, healthy eating, and weight control, people always think about incentives to improve effectiveness. And I am convinced, and I think we have some data to support the fact that it's really good at improving reach, not very good at improving effectiveness. So you need your other behavioral strategies that Samantha talked about before to ensure that once you get someone in the door for a physical activity intervention, they're actually still getting evidence-based principles, they're doing their goal setting, self-monitoring, those types of things that we know will enhance effectiveness and likely also retention. Then we can have infrastructure changes. And I think that, you know, I'm not sure how many folks here are familiar with the exercise as medicine intervention. And I guess I can't really get a show of hands, but with exercise as medicine, it includes physical activity screening that's integrated into electronic health record so that it can be part of the workflow of physicians or other providers that interact with patients, which can improve screening. And then by screening people that are not meeting physical activity guidelines, being able to do referrals to evidence-based approaches enhances reach at the individual level. And then there can be policy approaches that I think that, you know, when we work, especially, I really think some of the stuff that that was presented earlier with the schools and those types of things, when you're talking about working within what I would call complicated, but not complex systems. So schools, clinics, workplaces, where you can define boundaries and decision makers and levers of implementation or non-implementation. In those places, policy approaches can be very good to integrate methods to engage either organizations or individuals within our physical activity promotion interventions. And then I think about, you know, the idea of when we talk about scalability, designing for dissemination is kind of embedded across a lot of these things. And so when we talk about that partnership focused, really you're designing for dissemination. And I would say you're designing for, in the language we're using here, scale up and sustainability, and at least sustainability within the organizations that are part of the active trials that you're working on. Oh, and then I double dipped on screening and referral approaches with the exercises medicine. And then we have adaptations. And God, what a great talk we got from Samantha, and great characterizations of how they did the adaptations for their intervention for older adult physical activity. You know, one of the things that I think as folks think about future directions, you know, the earlier speakers were far too kind and didn't put up these complex looking figures that they used while they were developing their presentations. But this is one area that this looks complex, but really what we need to know when we're looking for opportunities for scale up, and we want to use adaptation as a strategy to improve scale up, which helps the fit between the intervention and the implementation setting. Really, what we really need to just think about is who, what, where, when, how, and why. And if we can answer those questions, you would be able to fill in this really wonderful figure that, I don't know that Sturman-Wiltse's reference popped up at the bottom of this. I think it's on my slide. I'm just not sure that it's showing up. Oh, and then one of the things that this is going to go to where I think our core research around scale up needs to start moving towards is, what's the relationship with adaptations when we're trying to scale an intervention in terms of this model, the core elements, fidelity to the core elements. So these are the things that really make it work. In our work, we talk more about the core. What are the underlying evidence-based principles that might be able to deliver it in a lot of different forms? And so I'm going to get to the point of where that might be more important. I did want to show you just a quick, this is a process model that we use when we talk about trying to build interventions that can be scaled within a given organizational setting, and then hopefully have characteristics that are generalizable to other settings. And so we use integrated research practice partnerships with the systems-based approach, which basically means that idea of, are you getting all the people within and across a system that would be important for implementation? And really we think of it from not just the implementation. So I use that as a broad term for implementation outcomes. And for us, focusing primarily on re-aim. But here the idea is exactly as we heard about from earlier speakers, is really leveraging in a partnership both what we know from the evidence, but focused primarily on those core principles of intervention effectiveness. And then we also focus on evidence of the delivery system. Like what's the mission, the goals, the values, as well as the infrastructure that's available. And then from there, we try and find fit of evidence-based principles to fit with the system resources and mission. And we have a process to do that where you can prioritize issues, shared generation of research questions, then you do that EBI as evidence selection, then D&I strategy selection. All these things are done collaboratively. And then of course there's adaptation. And we go through the process that was described in the slide previously, or at least the reporting of it was described previously. Then what we would do is something that we'd call integration trials. So a trial of whatever that fit or the resulting adapted intervention is. We would do an evaluation based on re-aim to determine, does it reach the population we want it to? Was it as effective as we thought it should be? Can it be adopted across different settings that are similar to the implementation level? Then it's implementation fidelity and finally with maintenance of both individual and organizational level outcomes. So we do that evaluation, and then we kind of get down to the point where there's a decision within the system that we're working with, and that decision can be dichotomized into rethinking, which sends people back up to the top of the prioritization as well, or it can be we're going to sustain and work towards scale up. So I'm back to the key research questions, and I know that I've used my 15 minutes, and I have a couple other slides at the end that I thought we could go through if I had time, but I think this will be good to kind of end on these ones. So, I think this is really a key issue. What's important, the form, the function, or what combination of both when thinking about reaching large populations, especially those that can most benefit. So really focused on this advancing health equity component and broad adoption across community and clinical settings. So that'd be one area that I think is really, really key, because if we continue to, in some ways, it's kind of like, when is the intervention new? Right? Have we done so much adaptation that our friends in Australia are going to kick us all the way back to efficacy trials, which, basically means we're now another 15 years before that's going to get anywhere, right? If you just think about a 5-year efficacy trial, a 5-year effectiveness trial, and then a dissemination trial, you're right back to that same issue of the long lag. Which brings me to my second question, which I think we should start looking at the time point. Like when we have evidence that's available to promote physical activity, we have new evidence, what's the lag between the time that we have that evidence and the time that it's scaled? And so I think that's another place. Do we have, like, these partnership approaches are great. That's all I've done all my career, but they take a long time. Are there other ways that we could be doing this? And is the scalability of a given intervention more or less likely to help us reduce that time from evidence discovery to application and population level impact? I think this is a key one that we still don't have measured very much. What are the characteristics of interventions that are more likely to be scaled? I think we have really good data. Like I said, if you go back to diffusions of innovations, I think there's great evidence to suggest that relative advantage, compatibility, complexity, those are all likely important. But what's most important within the physical activity context, I think, is an area. And then this one, is where we're kind of doing things now with the project that Caitlin talked about, where we're trying to do interventions that are being completed in a complex system, which is a community, where you have partnerships and members of partnerships that are not necessarily accountable to one another from a fiscal, from a mission, from any of those types of perspectives. And it's sometimes hard to get your hands around what are all the important pieces within a complex system to get something taken to scale versus complicated systems, which, as I said, within schools, within healthcare settings, you have a lot more understanding of the boundaries of those settings and where the decision-making points are. So you can look through workflow, you can look at who's responsible for what. And within those settings, people are typically responsible in some hierarchical way within their organization. And so I think that, this to me kind of gets to the point where we've got a lot of scale up generalizations that come out of the fantastic group in Australia about their public health system, but their public health system has research integrated into the service delivery. And so it's built in a way to do that. And so, well, I think those methods and the generalizations that we get from that are valuable for complicated systems. I don't know that they generalize to complex systems. So I think that there's a lot of research that's available there. And then finally, what are the mechanisms of successful scale up, which, if we manage to get it, why did we manage to get it? And so we heard about the determinants. And I would say at this point that this is where you need to bring in a good explanatory theory to be able to highlight propositions and test propositions. And that's where I will stop.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Estabrooks. Thank you all, great presentations. I will read off Heather's comment. Paul, from your perspective, how do you balance adaptation, fidelity, and cost?
Yeah.
How do you know when adaptation has gone too far to reduce cost, for example, which is key to sustainability, of course, but risks compromising effectiveness?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And so I would say that, I think that you need to measure each of these things. So first of all, you need to understand, what is the cost benefit relationship, and what, if you're reducing costs, what's the reduction in benefit? And, and some of our interventions are really good, Heather. Some of our interventions are getting people way above what the public health standard would be. And so in some, I think that it's probably okay that we get a little bit of a voltage drop, that we see some reduction in effectiveness, as long as we're not bringing it down to a place where people aren't still getting that kind of meaningful change. And so I think there's a balance there. I didn't hit on it today, even though I talk about it all the time, is that, from a scalability perspective, I always think about, cost per additional unit served, as a really important piece. And, So you asked me about how do we balance these things. I would say that I'm pretty open to any adaptation that adheres to core principles. So that means I'm typically okay if you reduce sessions. I'm typically okay if you change the personnel that are delivering. I'm typically okay if you want to move something from an in-person to a telephone, as long as it's not something that in-person piece wasn't part of a group dynamics approach that now you're violating a core principle. But then in terms of the adaptation, how too far is really, I think that this is an area that we need to keep studying, because at this point, I don't think people in adaptation, the way that we're talking about scale up right now, I don't think the adaptations are very big that people are doing. I think they're pretty incremental, and that's us too. I'm not pointing fingers at anybody. Our adaptations are pretty incremental. And I still like going back to the idea of Rogers of reinvention, that you know what the functioning principles are, and then you create something and make sure you address all of those. And it's a higher risk, but potentially higher scale up reward.
So we only have 5 minutes left, and there are a couple questions, but I want to give each panelist a minute, only 1 minute, to either provide kind of the one key construct that we didn't talk about today, or maybe a key recommendation for folks to think about scalability and adaptation and dissemination in their work. You have 1 minute to provide any kind of recommendation or feedback. Who would like to go first?
I can take a stab at. I think I don't, just off the top of my head, I'm not sure, but I saw one of the questions in the chat, which is a really good one, about tips and strategies to establish partnerships. And so I think that partnerships have been absolutely critical in all of the work that we've done in communities and scaling up. And so I think spending the time to develop those partnerships, I think, would be one of the tips that we've learned, and that it takes a really long time to develop those partnerships, but they can be really valuable for designing studies that are relevant to the communities that we're trying to target, and also like interventions that are relevant, but also like what are the questions that the community wants answered that we can help answer. And so getting relevant studies. So that's my hot tip.
And I think funders are funding partnership development, so that's a good thing that funders have kind of gotten with that. Caitlin?
I'll piggyback off of Lindsay there, and I think just leveraging those partnerships and systems. So if you know of a organization in a community that's already doing something similar, it's going to be easier for them to pick up and adapt your program and adopt it, and then potentially institutionalize it if they already have the resources there. And now you're just kind of capitalizing on that opportunity and growing that partnership. So I think what we find out a lot is people are already overburdened, and if we can't get them to find a place for our program, it's not going to happen. But if they're already doing something similar and they can just kind of incorporate it into that, it's a little bit more successful.
Great points. Samantha?
Sure. So I'll pick up on something that Paul said about designing for dissemination. And we talk about this all the time on our team, but we talk about it as beginning with the end in mind, which is one of the names, conveniently, of one of the World Health Organization and ExpandNet tools for scaling up. It's called Beginning with the End in Mind. And that brings me to a paper from one of our Australian colleagues, Cassandra Lane's 2021 paper, where she talks about scaled up physical activity interventions. And she sort of raises this point in the discussion about why are we designing interventions that are really intense contact and fully in person when we want to scale up and we know that's not going to be feasible anymore. So, sort of one main adaptation is mode of delivery. And so if we just start with the mode of delivery we know we'll use at large scale, we might save ourselves some time and resources.
Great point. Last but not least, Paul?
Oh man, these guys were so good, and I'm just typing away at other folks as we're going through. I really, like what everyone said. And if someone, maybe I just say, if you're getting started on this stuff, the idea of looking for a pull from your community partners is really key in this work. And, and what I'm saying there is much like Caitlin said, look for organizations that would have shared value in the promotion of physical activity, and would have physical activity promotion as potentially one of the things that they would prioritize, and if not prioritize, at least think of as important. And then I'd say consider yourself a resource and a member of that community, that you're not there just as a researcher, but you're there to, as we talked about at the beginning, you're there to help them get something that works for their community. And even when you do randomized trials, communities are really engaged in that kind of stuff, as long as you're there when the trial's done and can help them to sort out, apply, and benefit from the information that you've gotten. So that's my advice.
Well, thank you all so much. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, attendees, for being here today. I think this is really great work, and we keep moving forward in all of this. So we will share contact information, share materials from today. I think we are all open to having more conversations about this and moving this work forward. So everyone, have a great rest of your afternoon. Thank you so much again, and happy National Public Health Week. And let's get outside and do something active. Okay, take care.
Thanks, everybody.